welcome to this review of my Sony KI-9700 title keyboard. I bought this one a while ago off of eBay. Ben proxied it for me from the US, and it's got some very interesting and unusual switches you don't run into all that often. SMK spring over dome. Moreover, it's got a version of this switch that I hadn't really heard of before, and in fact this type of switch hasn't been documented all that well yet. I have a loose switch of the more typical version here. They're easily recognized by their weird slider design, which is very large. Now, as the name suggests, it uses rubber domes, but not a big old silicone sheet like this that you might be more familiar with, but instead every switch has its own discrete dome inside of it. The black thing that you see at the bottom is a conductive pad that is pressed down on a set of exposed contacts printed on the PCB. This closes a circuit and lets the keyboard know that a key has been pressed. It's also, highly uncommonly for a dome switch, clicky. If you look closely in the middle of the slider, there's a black click jacket which is fired down when you press a key, more or less exactly like Cherry MX Blue. It's been reported that these have a very muffled click when mounted inside a board though, and I can see why. If you put them on a table, same as with a backing PCB I guess, the click almost completely disappears, which seems like a major design oversight. However, the switches in the Sony are quite different. First of all, you'll note the slider is grey rather than white, and second, the design is different. The middle is closed off and there is no sign of the clicker. That's because this is the tactile version, but it gets weirder. See, if you open up the board and look at the switches, you'll find that first of all, the domes are yellow rather than light grey, and second, there is still some sort of pusher on the bottom of the domes, but it's not black and neither is it conductive. There is also no spring inside, making this a bit of a switch misnomer. Personally, I'd go for something like SMK integrated dome. And the reason it has no conductive pads quickly becomes clear if you look at the PCB, which has a membrane sheet on top of it. So instead of working on the PCB directly, the domes push the membrane onto the PCB, much like a normal rubber dome keyboard. Funny thing is, when playing around with a discrete switch like this, it actually feels really good. It's very snappy and tactile, a bit like Topra, but better, more like BTC dome with slider. Nice. You can see the dome invert quite snappily too, but note how it is quite a bit below the bottom of the switch when you do. Now herein lies the problem, because when it's mounted inside a keyboard, the PCB is held at a distance that's much shorter than how far the domes protrude if given the chance, so it never gets to fully invert. Basically, the PCB sits almost right against the switch bottoms, which looks like it's far too short to get the most out of the switch, because the snappiness is all in the bottom of the key travel, just like with the clickiness I guess. And as a result, when mounted inside the keyboard, the switches never show the snappiness that they do when used loose. In fact, it feels like shit, kinda crappy toffee syndrome. The top keys are even worse. They use smaller versions of the switch with a green dome rather than a yellow one. Now these feel even worse, and curiously low travel as well. It's really fucking terrible. Glad that this wasn't on the main block, to be honest. It's really a shame because they really do feel great outside a keyboard. Mitsumi miniature switches have this problem as well. They're still kinda snappy in a way, but they just don't feel fulfilling at all, and they feel short throw and scratchy too. All in all, just bleh. The board itself is quite well made actually, not something you might expect from a rubber dome keyboard. To be honest, quite a few vintage Sony boards are well made. The case is fairly thick plastic and it comes with a metal mounting plate for the switches, bringing the total weight to a bit over 1.2 kilos. Not bad considering its relatively small size and the fact that it uses dome switches. It appears to have been part of the Sony EVO-9700 system, which was a dual-deck editor/recorder using the Video High 8 format, which was Sony's answer to Super VHS. I couldn't find a manufacture date anywhere in the keyboard, but I did find several articles from Popular Photography from 1992 to 1994 listing this system, so I guess it was made in the early 90s. It's held together by 7 screws at the back and it uses tiny little flip-out feet. You can see the model sticker here as well, and it's just that, a model sticker, because it only shows the model number and that it was made in Japan, which makes sense as SMK is a Japanese company. The PCB also has plenty of SMK markings on it as well, so I think it's safe to assume that they made it. Oh yeah, and as you can see from these scratch marks here, apparently it belonged to the city of Topeka, Chapter 4. The PCB also has plenty of diodes in it, so I think it might have had N-key rollover, which is, again, extremely unusual for a rubber dome keyboard. All in all, it kind of makes you wonder why didn't they just put proper metal contact switches in this fucker, really. Also, the case has brass screw sockets everywhere, which is always a big plus in my opinion. Nice! Here's what the cable looks like, by the way. It's a roughly 1.3 meter straight cable with what might appear to be a PS2 connector, but it's not. It's some kind of proprietary 5-pin plug, I think, or maybe some type of media connector that I'm not familiar with. The layout is obviously somewhat old, but also just oozes specialty keyboard. As such, it has no Windows keys, or even a Control or Alt key actually. In fact, it's somewhat stingy with its modifiers. It only has Shift keys and a caps lock. There's no F keys either, just a bunch of nav and character related buttons such as color, cha, ins, and cha del. Typically for a Japanese keyboard, it's got an ISO style enter key along with a single unit backspace, but there's no split spacebar or any Japanese character keys. On the right are some Japanese style arrow keys as well. They tended to like their diamond shaped nav clusters, and a full set of box drawing characters too, which would have been presumably quite useful during title generation. Overall, I'd have to say that even with some reprogramming, it'd be quite difficult to make a useful layout out of this. There'd only be room for 8 F keys and 8 numpad keys, and there's not really any space to put the missing modifiers like Control and Alt, because the bottom row is completely empty except for the 7.5 unit spacebar. As for the keycaps themselves, they're kind of medium thick-ish ABS, and they have very sharp legends which appear to be silk screened or something. I've looked at them with a loupe and I couldn't see any raising of the surface at all, and they're very sharp. They look a bit like extremely high quality die subs, although this is generally considered to be very difficult or even impossible with ABS, due to the temperatures involved in die sublimation. Regardless, they look good. The keys at the top are clearly silk-screened or pad-printed ABS though, and they actually all come with a little stabilizer to prevent binding, which indeed they don't. They don't even use the same mount. These use a cross mount similar to Cherry MX. Overall, it's a keyboard with a crappy layout and crappy switches, but there could have been potential here as the build is great and it looks really cool, and I think that if it would be possible to give the switches full travel somehow, which I realize isn't practically feasible, you'd have to bottom all the way out for example, which can't be a good thing, but anyway, they'd feel much better. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.